11,000 years ago, somewhere in what's now southeastern Turkey, a group of hunter-gatherers did something that shouldn't have been possible. They quarried massive limestone pillars, some weighing over 10 tons, carved them with intricate animal reliefs, arranged them into circular enclosures, and built a structure so sophisticated that when archaeologists finally found it, they had to rewrite the entire timeline of human civilization. This was Göbekli Tepe, and here's where it gets strange. After putting in what must have been thousands of hours of labor, after generations of building and rebuilding, after creating something that clearly held enormous meaning to the people who made it, they buried it. Not through neglect, not because it collapsed or crumbled with time. They filled it in deliberately, layer by layer, with soil and rubble and debris, until the towering pillars vanished beneath the earth. Why would anyone do that? Why would a community spend generations building a monument only to erase it with their own hands? That's the mystery we're going to sit with tonight. If you're using this to drift off to sleep, that's exactly what it's here for. So go ahead, get comfortable, and if you want, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love seeing that. Sydney at sunrise, Chicago at midnight, all reading the same words at completely different moments. It's a small thing, but it connects us. And if you're someone who listens to these often, consider following this show on Spotify. It's ad-free, music-free, just voice, and it's honestly the best way to support what I do here. A quick 5-star review helps more than you'd think too. Links in the description if you want to find it there. Now, back to Göbekli Tepe. I want to be upfront about something before we go further. What we know for certain and what we think might be true are two very different things. The evidence, the stone, the soil layers, the artifacts, that's solid. That's measurable. But the meaning behind that evidence, why they built it, why they buried it, that's interpretation. Educated interpretation built on decades of careful archaeology, but interpretation nonetheless. Tonight, we're going to walk through both. The hard evidence first, then the theories that try to make sense of it. Because here's the thing that makes this site so important. Before Göbekli Tepe was uncovered, most archaeologists believed monumental architecture, big organized construction projects, required farming, required settled villages, required the kind of surplus food and social structure that only agriculture could provide. Göbekli Tepe blew that idea apart. These were hunter-gatherers. People who moved with the seasons, who hadn't yet domesticated wheat or barley, who were still hunting gazelle and gathering wild grains. And somehow they organized enough labor and enough shared belief to build something monumental anyway. So the burial isn't just a strange footnote, it's the second half of an equally strange story. Something was built with intention, and then it seems something was hidden with intention too. Was it ritual closure, environmental collapse, social conflict, or something we haven't even considered yet? To answer that, we need to go back to the beginning, to the moment a Kurdish shepherd walked across a quiet hill and noticed something odd sticking out of the ground. The hill sits in southeastern Anatolia, in a region of Turkey close to the border with Syria, in the northern reaches of what archaeologists call the Fertile Crescent. This is the broader landscape where, over thousands of years, humans first began experimenting with agriculture, first domesticated wheat and barley and sheep, first settled into the villages that would eventually become cities. It's a landscape thick with history, layered with thousands of years of human activity, which is part of why nobody noticed anything unusual about this particular hill for so long. Locally it's called Göbekli Tepe. The name translates roughly to Potbelly Hill, a description that fits its shape well enough. From a distance it looks like nothing special, a gentle rise on the edge of the Harran Plain, covered in scrubby vegetation, dotted with the kind of broken pottery and worked stone you can find scattered across half the hillsides in this region. For decades it was just that, a hill among hills. Something farmers walked past, sheep grazed on, and nobody thought twice about. In 1963, researchers from the University of Chicago and Istanbul University conducted a broad archaeological survey of the region, cataloguing sites of potential interest across southeastern Turkey. Göbekli Tepe was included in that survey. They noted the presence of some limestone slabs, some flint tools scattered across the surface, and they made a reasonable assumption. This looked like a medieval cemetery, they thought. Broken pieces of a Byzantine or early Islamic burial ground, unremarkable by regional standards. They wrote it down, filed it away, and moved on. It's worth sitting with that for a second. Trained archaeologists looked directly at what would turn out to be one of the most significant discoveries in the history of the field, and they walked right past it. Not because they were careless, but because nothing about the surface hinted at what lay beneath. The site stayed quiet for another 3 decades. Then, in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt was reviewing old survey records, looking for promising locations to investigate as part of his broader research into the prehistory of the region. He came across the notes on Göbekli Tepe, and something about the description caught his attention. The flint scattered across the surface wasn't just any flint. It matched patterns he recognized from other Neolithic sites, tools associated with periods far older than a medieval cemetery would suggest. Curious, he decided to visit in person. When Schmidt walked the hill himself, he noticed something the earlier survey had missed, or perhaps hadn't had the context to interpret correctly. The limestone slabs weren't grave markers. They were the tops of much larger structures, buried beneath centuries, maybe millennia, of accumulated soil. He later described the moment as immediately recognizing that this was not a natural hill at all. It was, as he put it, an artificial mound built up over generations through human activity, construction, and eventually deliberate burial. Excavations began the following year in 1995, and what they found upended assumptions that had stood for decades. To understand why this mattered so much, it helps to know what archaeologists usually mean when they talk about a tell. A tell is a specific kind of archaeological mound, formed gradually over centuries as generations of people build, abandon, and rebuild settlements on the same spot. Mud brick houses collapse, get levelled, and new houses go up on top of the rubble. Repeat that process for a few thousand years, and you end up with an artificial hill, layered like a cake, with each layer representing a different period of occupation. Tells are common across the Fertile Crescent, and archaeologists know how to read them. You dig down, and you move backward through time, layer by layer, structure by structure. Göbekli Tepe looked like it might be a tell from the surface. But it wasn't, not in the conventional sense. There were no mud brick houses stacked on top of each other, no evidence of a village slowly growing and shrinking over centuries. What Schmidt and his team found instead were massive stone enclosures built directly into bedrock, filled with soil and rubble that seemed to have been placed there deliberately rather than accumulating naturally through the slow decay of daily life. This wasn't a settlement that had crumbled with age. This was something that had been actively, intentionally covered. Dating a site like this requires more than just looking at the stones themselves. Archaeologists use a combination of relative dating, figuring out the sequence of events by looking at which layers sit above or below others, and absolute dating, using scientific techniques like radiocarbon analysis to pin down actual calendar years. At Göbekli Tepe, organic material trapped within the fill layers, charcoal, plant remains, has allowed researchers to establish radiocarbon dates for different phases of construction and burial. The results, published and refined over years of careful analysis, place the earliest construction phases at the site to roughly 9,600 BCE, which works out to around 11,600 years ago. Later phases show continued activity for a few thousand years after that, with the final burial episodes generally dated to sometime before 8,000 BCE. Those numbers matter enormously. They place Göbekli Tepe firmly in the Pre-Pottery Neolithic period, a time before the widespread adoption of pottery, before settled agricultural villages had become the norm, when much of the human population in this region was still living as hunter-gatherers, or was only just beginning to experiment with cultivating wild grains. The earliest phases of construction at the site predate Stonehenge by roughly 6,000 years. They predate the pyramids of Egypt by even more than that. When you're dealing with dates this early, precision is inherently limited, and researchers are careful to speak in ranges rather than exact years. But even accounting for that uncertainty, the implications are hard to overstate. Monumental construction on this scale, this early, simply wasn't supposed to be possible according to the models archaeologists had relied on before Göbekli Tepe came to light. It's also worth being honest about the limits of what we currently know. Despite decades of excavation, only a fraction of the site has actually been uncovered. Geophysical surveys using ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry suggest that there are many more enclosures buried beneath the hill, structures that haven't been excavated at all, still hidden under soil that hasn't been touched since the ancient builders themselves placed it there. Current estimates suggest the excavated area represents only a small percentage of the total site. Whatever conclusions we draw from what has been uncovered so far need to be held with a certain humility, because the ground beneath our feet may still be holding pieces of the story we haven't found yet. So that's where we stand, a hill that wasn't a hill. A discovery nearly missed twice. A dating range that rewrites what we thought we knew about the capabilities of hunter-gatherer societies. And a site that is, even now, still mostly buried, still keeping most of its secrets underground. To understand what these people were capable of and why this mattered so much, we need to look closer at who they actually were. If you could stand on that hill 11,500 years ago, you wouldn't see farmers driving ploughs or smoke rising from a permanent town. You'd see movement, footprints, paths worn into the soil by people who didn't quite live in one place, but also weren't simply wandering aimlessly anymore. Archaeologists call this the Pre-Pottery Neolithic. It's a mouthful, but the name is literal. Neolithic, New Stone Age, because stone tools are changing, becoming more refined, more specialized. Pre-pottery, because the one thing you do not see yet is fired clay vessels. No jars, no bowls, no storage pots. This is a world before ceramics, before clay kilns, before shiny painted dishes. And yet, in that world before pottery, somebody was hauling multi-ton pillars out of the bedrock and standing them upright in carefully planned circles. To understand who they were, it helps to let go of a simple picture. These people were not fully settled villagers, the way you might imagine later farming communities. But they also weren't roaming cavemen in animal skins, stumbling from cave to cave. Their lives were somewhere in between, in a long, slow turning of the dial from mobility toward rootedness. Most groups in this period seem to have followed seasonal patterns. They knew where wild gazelles tended to pass in spring, where pistachios ripened in late summer, where water was reliable after the winter rains. They moved through a familiar territory in cycles, returning to the same places year after year. Think of it less like aimless wandering and more like a sophisticated calendar mapped onto the land. Göbekli Tepe appears to have been one of those recurring destinations. Not a village, not a place where you raised children year-round, but a node in a seasonal circuit, a place you and your relatives and your allies might gather at specific times, maybe when certain plants were ripe, or when migrating herds passed nearby. The subsistence base for these people was still hunting and gathering, but the words hunting and gathering can hide a lot of detail. This landscape, on the northern edge of the Fertile Crescent, offered a rich menu. Wild sheep and goats on the rocky slopes, gazelles moving across the plains, birds, hares, maybe wild cattle. In the shallow soils around the hill grew wild cereals that would one day become wheat and barley, along with lentils, peas, and various nuts and fruits. Archaeologists find vast quantities of animal bones at Göbekli Tepe, especially from gazelle, along with wild sheep, wild boar, and other species. They also find grinding stones, mortars, and pestles, tools for processing seeds and grains. This suggests a mixed subsistence strategy: meat from large hunts, plant foods gathered in bulk and laboriously ground into something more digestible. At this time, people along the Fertile Crescent were starting to do something new with the plants they relied on. Instead of just harvesting whatever grew, they began to interfere gently in the life cycles of wild cereals. Maybe they reaped stalks with flint sickles and accidentally scattered the seeds closer to favoured campsites. Maybe they started weeding or selectively cutting the plants with bigger seeds. Over generations, those small choices nudged certain grasses toward domestication. We're not yet in the world of neat rectangular fields and domesticated crops, but we're not in pure foraging either. It's an experimental phase. Early cultivation, people still move seasonally, but they're also beginning to bet on specific patches of land, to return to particular stands of wild grain they've helped along. In that context, a place like Göbekli Tepe makes more sense. If different groups knew they would all be in this region at predictable times of year, they had an anchor point, a hill they could invest in, even while their daily lives stayed mobile. Socially, these were small groups, maybe 20, 30, 50 people travelling together most of the time, what anthropologists sometimes call bands. But bands did not exist in isolation. They formed networks. You visited your in-laws in the next valley. You traded obsidian blades for fine flint. You shared news about water sources and herds. Over time, these ties formed something like a loose web of alliances stretching across the region. Evidence from Göbekli Tepe and nearby sites suggests that when people gathered there, they didn't just sit quietly around the stones. The density of animal bones, many of them showing cut marks, points to episodes of intensive butchering. Not just everyday meals, but feasting, large-scale consumption events beyond what a single small group would need. Feasting is more than just overeating. It's politics through food. You can cement alliances with a generous meal. You can celebrate marriages, negotiate disputes, honour the dead, or mark the turning of the year. To kill and process that many animals, to move that much stone, you need labour. Not one band, but several. Cooperative projects like this are a strong hint that these people had complex social mechanisms for sharing work and sharing rewards. Maybe some individuals acted as organisers, ritual specialists, negotiators. Not kings or pharaohs, but people whose voices carried weight when it came time to plan the next building phase, or to decide which group hunted which herd. It's important here to push back on a deeply rooted stereotype. The word Stone Age often conjures images of crude, brutal lives, hunched cavemen grunting at each other, devoid of art or deep thought. Göbekli Tepe does not fit that picture. The pillars are not random blocks. They are carved, smoothed, aligned. Many bear reliefs of animals, symbols, abstract shapes. The layout of the enclosures is deliberate, with central pillars surrounded by smaller ones, all anchored in carefully prepared sockets. This is not the work of people who lack symbolic thinking. It is the work of minds capable of abstraction, of planning, of shared meaning. When dozens of individuals agree that a certain arrangement of stones matters enough to justify weeks or months of heavy labour, you are looking at a culture rich in ideas, stories and beliefs, even if we don't know the details. So how does a large communal project emerge before full-blown farming, before pottery, before permanent villages? The traditional model of prehistory ran in a neat line. First agriculture, then surplus food, then specialists and priests, and finally monuments. Göbekli Tepe forces a different order. Here it seems that the monument came first, or at least very early. One possibility is that the shared rituals and gatherings at places like this actually help drive the shift toward more settled life. If your social world depends on returning to the same sacred hill year after year, it becomes advantageous to secure nearby resources, to tend the stands of wild grain around it, to keep herds within range. Ritual can pull people together, and once they're together, new economic arrangements become possible. Another way to say it, they didn't build Göbekli Tepe because they were already farmers. They may have become farmers in part because they built places like Göbekli Tepe. And all of this, remember, is happening in a world without a single clay pot, no pottery sherds crunching underfoot, no ceramic storage jars lined up in houses. Just stone, bone, wood, fibre, and the minds of people who had learned over thousands of years how to read a difficult landscape and how to work together when it truly mattered. These were the builders, seasonally mobile hunter-gatherers standing on the threshold of farming, experimenting with plants, building social networks through feasts and shared labour, capable of complex symbolic thought long before cities or writing. When they carved those T-shaped pillars and ringed them with stone, they were doing something new in human history. To see how deliberate that something new really was, we need to look more closely at the circles themselves, at the pillars and their arrangement, and at the choices the builders made in shaping stone. If you step down into one of the main enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, at least in your imagination, you're not walking into a random cluster of rocks. You're entering a space that was laid out according to a pattern, repeated with variations over and over again. Most of the best-known enclosures are roughly circular or oval. Think of them as sunken rooms carved into the hill, with stone walls forming a ring around the edge. In that ring, set into prepared sockets, stand a series of smaller T-shaped pillars, like a stone crowd facing inward, and in the centre, anchoring everything, stand two much larger T-pillars, taller, more massive, and more finely worked than the rest. This repeating scheme, circle, surrounding ring of pillars, central pair, shows up so consistently that it's hard to see it as anything but intentional architecture. It's a plan someone or several someones knew from the beginning that each enclosure needed a boundary, a group of witnesses around the edge, and a pair of giants in the middle. The T-shape itself is simple, a vertical shaft with a transverse block across the top. But when you look closely at the central pillars, details start to emerge that suggest these aren't just abstract forms. On several of them, archaeologists have found carved belts circling the waist, complete with decorated buckles. From those belts hang what look like loincloths or foxskin aprons. On the fronts and sides you see long, thin arms carved in low relief, the hands resting on the belly. Taken together, these features have led many researchers to interpret the T-pillars as highly stylized human figures. The top bar becomes a sort of head and shoulders, the shaft becomes a torso. The belt, the hands, the posture, all imply a standing body, upright, facing inward toward the centre of the space. That interpretation is not universally agreed upon, and we should be cautious here. We don't have eyes or faces, we don't have inscriptions telling us, these are our ancestors or these are gods, but it is striking that the pillars that dominate each enclosure, the ones placed in the most central, commanding positions, are also the ones that most clearly carry these human-like elements. If something at Göbekli Tepe is meant to be someone, the central T-pillars are the leading candidates. Seeing them as stylized beings changes how the space feels in the mind's eye. You're no longer just stepping into a stone circle. You're stepping into a room full of presences, ringed by upright figures, with two towering bodies in the middle. You become the smallest, most fragile thing in the arrangement. To make those presences stand there at all required engineering, not just imagination. The limestone of the hill itself was the quarry. In some places you can still see the negative impressions in the bedrock, where pillars were cut out, long rectangular voids like missing teeth. Workers would have used flint tools, hammerstones, and perhaps wooden wedges soaked with water to fracture the stone, slowly freeing each block. Once quarried, the pillars had to be shaped. Faces smoothed, corners trued, T-tops squared off, reliefs carved. This is slow, repetitive work, and it implies planning. You don't invest that kind of labour into a stone unless you already know where it's going to stand and how it will be used. Then there's the problem of transport. Some pillars weigh many tons. Without wheels, without draft animals as far as we can tell, they had to rely on human muscle, perhaps aided by wooden sledges, rollers, ropes, and carefully prepared paths. You can imagine teams of people coordinating their efforts, chants or calls keeping the rhythm as stone inches forward over packed earth. Setting the pillars upright is its own feat. The builders cut pillar-shaped sockets into the bedrock or prepared foundations of stone and rubble. Then, somehow, they manoeuvred each pillar into its slot and raised it until gravity could take over. Whether they used earthen ramps, rocking techniques, or something else, the result was the same. A forest of fixed, stable monoliths that have stayed upright for over 10,000 years. The architecture doesn't just show effort, it shows control over movement and attention. To get into some of the enclosures, you likely had to pass through narrow openings or descend ramps and steps. These thresholds mark a boundary between the outside world and the interior space. Crossing them probably mattered. It's the difference between standing on open hillside and stepping into a contained, charged circle. Once inside, your sightlines are not accidental. The ring walls and surrounding pillars create a kind of visual funnel toward the centre. The smaller pillars around the edge are aligned so that their flat faces and whatever animals or symbols they carry look inward, focusing attention on the central pair. The central T-pillars themselves are oriented along specific axes, often roughly north-south, though the exact alignments vary from enclosure to enclosure. All of this suggests that the builders were thinking not just in terms of stone and weight, but in terms of how people would experience space, where eyes would naturally go, where bodies would pause, where a speaker, a dancer, or a ritual specialist would stand if they wanted to be framed by the tallest pillars. Interestingly, the enclosures are not all clones of one another. Some are larger, some smaller. The exact number of surrounding pillars changes. The animal imagery differs, the way the central pillars are carved, and even how carefully they're finished, varies from circle to circle. This variation is a clue. It might mean that the enclosures were built at different times, reflecting shifting tastes, beliefs, or technologies. Earlier circles could have served one purpose, with later ones adapting the same basic pattern to new needs. Or each enclosure might have been associated with a particular group or lineage, each bringing its own preferred symbols and slight tweaks to the shared architectural grammar. Where one circle feels more massive and austere, another feels busier, more crowded with imagery. Some have more elaborate floors, others simpler arrangements. Over time, certain enclosures were deliberately filled in and new ones built nearby, suggesting a sequence of use and abandonment, renewal and redesign. Taken together, the layout of Göbekli Tepe, the sunken ovals, the central pairs of stylized beings, the managed thresholds and sightlines, the subtle differences between circles, reads like a long, slow conversation in stone. The same basic sentence being spoken again and again, but with different emphases, different inflections, perhaps different speakers. We can't yet translate that conversation, but by paying close attention to how the stones are arranged and how they shape human experience, we start to see Göbekli Tepe less as a mysterious pile of megaliths and more as architecture in the full sense, built space, designed to support particular kinds of gatherings, gestures and meanings. To get closer to those meanings, we have to look not just at where the stones stand, but at what's carved onto them, the animals, the symbols, the patterns that turn bare pillars into a silent, crowded bestiary. If you walk around the site in your mind, pillar by pillar, you start to notice that Göbekli Tepe is absolutely swarming with life. Not human faces, not trees or houses, but animals. The limestone becomes a kind of frozen migration. Some creatures show up again and again. Foxes are everywhere. Slender bodies, long tails, often in motion, slipping around the edges of pillars or running along belts. Wild boars appear too, heavy-bodied, bristling, sometimes shown with exaggerated tusks. Snakes coil and slither in low relief, bands of carved stone curling around the shafts. There are birds, cranes or storks with long legs and beaks, vultures with hunched postures and powerful wings. There are insects and arthropods, spiders, scorpions, maybe beetles, etched in with surprising precision. And then there are the things that aren't quite animals. Abstract signs, H-shapes, ladders, crescents, circles, V-shapes stacked like chevrons, rows of small notches. They're not random scratches, they repeat. They appear in similar places on different pillars. They sit next to certain animals more often than others. It's as if, alongside the carved bestiary, there's a parallel vocabulary of marks. It's tempting, looking at all this, to want to read it like a storybook, to point at a fox and say trickster at a vulture, and say death at a snake, and say rebirth, to map familiar myths right onto the stone. But this is where we have to be careful. We know what they carved. We don't know what they called these animals, what feelings they attached to them, what place they held in songs and stories. A fox to a modern viewer might be clever or sly. To a hunter at the end of the Ice Age, a fox might also be a competitor, a nighttime thief, a source of fur, an omen, or the emblem of a particular group. There's no direct translation key. The same goes for the abstract signs. They might be counting marks, clan symbols, directional cues, or references to myths we'll never hear. They might be entirely local categories, the sign we use when we talk about that hill over there, or the mark that stands for the time of year when the gazelles arrive. Without a Rosetta Stone, all we can do is notice patterns and explore possibilities. When archaeologists catalogue the carvings, a few broad interpretations come up again and again. One is that some animals functioned as totems or clan markers. In many later societies, groups identify with a particular species. We are the people of the raven. We follow the bear at Göbekli Tepe. You sometimes find a pillar dominated by one kind of creature, or a small set of related ones, while another pillar, in the same enclosure, favours a different caste entirely. It's possible that each pillar belonged to a different group that gathered there, their chosen animals acting almost like banners. Another interpretation is that some of these figures represent mythic beings rather than ordinary wildlife. A fox might not just be a fox, but a character in a shared story about how the world was shaped, or how death first came into being, or why people must hunt in a certain way. The vultures might connect to ideas about what happens to the body after death, or how spirits move between worlds. In later Near Eastern iconography, we do see powerful composite beings, human-animal hybrids, guardian creatures. At Göbekli Tepe, we're at the very beginning of that visual tradition. Some of the more elaborate pillar scenes where animals overlap and intertwine could be snapshots from stories we no longer have. Others have suggested that certain animal combinations act as warnings. A snake plus a scorpion, for example, might just reflect the local ecosystem. But arranged together in a repeated pattern, they could become a shorthand for danger, for the realm of stings and bites, the places you step carefully. A vulture looming over a headless body. Yes, there are decapitated figures in the reliefs. Might be a concrete reminder of what happens if you break certain rules or enter forbidden spaces. In this sense, the pillars could be broadcasting a kind of visual etiquette, a set of taboos and cautions wrapped in animal form. It's also possible that some of the pillars, taken as a whole, tell longer narratives. On one face you might have a sequence, boar below, fox in the middle, birds above, abstract signs at the top. Maybe that's just decorative stacking, or maybe for the people who carved it, that vertical arrangement mirrored a story they told, moving from earth to sky, from hunt to feast, from this world to another. When researchers map where each carving appears, on which pillar, in which enclosure, on which face of the stone, a subtle order starts to emerge. Certain signs cluster in particular buildings. Some animals prefer the inner faces of pillars, addressing the centre. Others appear on the outward-facing sides, almost like they're speaking to the outside world. Cross-checking multiple enclosures, you see that similar combinations of animals and marks recur, not in exactly the same layout, but close enough to suggest a pattern. This has led some archaeologists to talk cautiously about sign systems. Not writing in the later sense, there's no clear evidence of fixed phonetic values, no sentences we can pass, but an organized way of placing images so that their arrangement would have been meaningful to insiders. An early graphic code where animal, position, and accompanying marks together carried layers of information. Whatever those layers were, they weren't invented in a vacuum. The creatures on the stones are the same creatures that moved through the hills and valleys around the site. Foxes and boars would have been regular presences in the hunting record. Vultures and other carrion birds would have circled over carcasses and perhaps human burials. Snakes and scorpions were ever-present threats under rocks and in long grass. The timing of these animals' movements mattered. Herds followed seasonal routes. Birds migrated along predictable paths. Some insects appeared only in certain months. If you lived by hunting and gathering, your calendar was written in animal behaviour as much as in the position of the sun. In that context, carving these beings into stone may have been a way of fixing the rhythms of the year, turning fleeting appearances into permanent reference points. Seen this way, Göbekli Tepe's pillars become more than just decorated architecture. They're a kind of memory palace for a foraging world, a place where the animals that fed you, threatened you, guided your movements and populated your stories are gathered and frozen in limestone. Each fox, each bird, each curling snake might have anchored conversations about when to move camp, how to conduct a hunt, which dangers to respect, which spirits to appease. We don't know the exact sentences, we probably never will. But by tracing the carved foxes and boars and birds across the site, we can at least glimpse the grammar, the sense that these were not random pictures, but deliberate choices, part of a shared symbolic language that linked people, animals and seasons together. And woven into that language, almost hidden among all the claws and beaks and fangs, are the rare unsettling images of human bodies, or parts of bodies that hint at an even deeper layer of meaning. If you go looking for people in the stones of Göbekli Tepe, you don't find what you might expect. There are no full-length statues of men and women standing in neat rows. No carved crowds, no kings or chiefs, no families. And yet, human presence is everywhere, if you know where to look. Start with the pillars themselves. Those big T-shaped monoliths in the centres of the enclosures are not just abstract blocks. Look closer and they begin to turn into bodies. Each has a broad head at the top, a vertical torso below. On some you can see a belt carved around the middle with a buckle and sometimes a little fox or other animal hanging down like a pendant. On the sides near the top of the shaft, there are long, thin reliefs that curve downward. Most archaeologists agree those are arms. The hands come together in front, fingers pointed toward what looks like a loincloth or some kind of garment. The pillars are wearing clothes, they are dressed. And the arms are not spread out like wings or raised in prayer. They're positioned the way a person might stand, composed, maybe formal. But the heads remain blank, no faces, no eyes, no mouths. Just that massive anonymous T. So you have this strange hybrid, clearly human in posture and dress, absolutely inhuman in its lack of individual features. It's as if the builders wanted human form without any one specific person. Not a portrait of this hunter or that storyteller, but a generalized figure. As someone who is also no one. In some enclosures there are two of these large T-pillars standing opposite one another in the center, surrounded by smaller pillars. The arrangement has led many people to imagine them as presences in a gathering. Two towering beings at the heart of a circle of other, perhaps lesser, figures. Were they ancestors, spirits? The idea of gods is tempting but anachronistic. Whatever they were, they stand in for human bodies in a place where actual bodies left subtler traces. Because while we don't have carved crowds, we do have evidence that real people were spending time here. When archaeologists study a site like Göbekli Tepe, they pay attention to the tiny, almost invisible scars left by use. Stone floors polished smooth in certain spots, microchips around the bases of pillars where people's feet, stones or tools repeatedly brushed past. Hearths and fire pits, some reused many times. Thin layers of compacted sediment that don't look like natural wind-blown dust, but the slow building up of trampled ground. Across the main enclosures there are concentrations of flint chips and broken tools in particular zones, as if people knelt or sat there to resharpen blades or prepare equipment. There are places where animal bones, often from feasting, cluster in discrete patches rather than being scattered at random. Some enclosures seem clean, with few domestic traces, more like spaces kept carefully free of everyday debris. Others, especially in later phases, show more mundane activity mixed in, taken together. This pattern suggests that Göbekli Tepe was not a quiet, empty monument. It was used, people gathered there, moved in and out, did things in specific areas. Maybe some places were for preparing food, some for sitting and watching, some for actions we would probably call ritual. That brings us back to the human body and what happened to it after death. The wider region around Göbekli Tepe over the following millennia gives us clear evidence for complex skull cults practices that singled out the human head for special treatment. At sites in the Levant and Anatolia, archaeologists have found skulls that were cleaned, sometimes plastered, sometimes painted, sometimes kept and displayed long after the rest of the body had decayed. In some cases, skulls were buried under house floors as if anchoring the living to the dead. At Göbekli Tepe itself, the evidence is more fragmentary, and researchers are careful not to overstate it. There are human bones on site, including skull fragments. Some skull pieces show cut marks that look deliberate, as though the soft tissue was removed with care. One skull fragment even appears to have small drilled holes, which might have allowed it to be suspended. That's suggestive. It hints at practices where heads or parts of heads were displayed or curated for a time. But we don't have neat rows of full burials under the floors. No intact grave with grave goods we can confidently interpret. If the dead were involved here, they were probably not being laid to rest the way they would be later in village cemeteries. More likely, Göbekli Tepe intersected with mortuary rituals at a particular stage, perhaps during exposure of bodies to the elements, or in ceremonies that involved ancestral skulls brought from elsewhere and then taken away again. So picture this not as a cemetery, but as one node in a larger cycle of care for the dead. Bodies or bones might pass through. Skulls might be displayed, songs sung, stories told. Then the remains moved on to their final resting places in camps or early settlements. If that's even roughly right, then who was in charge of all this? In a foraging world, you don't have priests in stone temples yet, but that doesn't mean you don't have specialists. Ethnographic parallels suggest that even small bands can have people who are regarded as especially skilled at dealing with the sacred healers, visionaries, keepers of stories, those who know the correct sequence of words and actions. At Göbekli Tepe, someone had to organize the labor to carve pillars weighing tons. Someone had to remember the order of the rituals. Someone had to decide where to place each carved animal and each human-shaped stone. There may have been ritual specialists who, while not priests in the later institutional sense, held particular authority in these spaces. But they were not alone. The architectural layout with multiple enclosures, repeated forms and signs of episodic use fits a picture where different foraging groups used the site perhaps at different times of year. Some might have been host groups from the local hills, familiar with the place, maintaining it between gatherings. Others could have been visiting bands coming from dozens or hundreds of kilometers away along seasonal routes, bringing their own foods, their own stories, their own animal totems. In that scenario, Göbekli Tepe becomes a kind of diplomatic ground, a neutral or at least shared space where disputes could be negotiated, alliances reaffirmed, marriages arranged, and information exchanged under the watchful, impersonal gaze of those faceless human pillars. The stones stand in for an order larger than any one band. You don't just argue with your neighbours here, you do it in front of the ancestors or the spirits or whatever those T-shapes represented. This is where the familiar word temple starts to strain. On one hand, the scale, the effort, the lack of domestic architecture, and the semi-human pillars all point to something beyond everyday life. A place set apart, charged with symbolic meaning, likely anchored in practices we'd be comfortable calling religious. On the other hand, the evidence for gatherings, feasting, tool-making, and possibly intergroup meetings suggests Göbekli Tepe was more than a standalone shrine. It looks less like a single church dropped into a blank landscape, and more like the ceremonial heart of a wider social and ritual network. A place where the sacred, the political, the economic, and the ancestral all overlapped. Those blank-faced human pillars, surrounded by animals and abstract signs, seem to hold that tension in stone. Human but not individual, body but not person, temple but also meeting ground. And whatever decision was made centuries later to bury the whole complex on purpose, it was made by people who had lived inside that tension for generations. So now we come to the strangest part of Göbekli Tepe's story. At some point, after generations of work and use, people started filling it in, covering the pillars, burying the enclosures, turning a place that had been carefully opened to the sky into a mound of packed earth and stone. How do we know that was on purpose, and not just the slow work of time? Archaeologists make a sharp distinction here between what they call natural sedimentation and deliberate backfill. Natural sedimentation is the quiet, patient process you'd expect if you simply abandoned a stone structure on a windy hill and walked away. Dust blows in and settles, rains wash in soil from higher slopes. Little collapses happen as walls lean and fall. Plant roots break things apart. Animals burrow. Over centuries, you get thin, uneven layers of fine sediment, occasional rockfalls, patches of rubble, near where walls used to stand. It's messy, it's gradual, and it's mostly local material that has trickled in from nearby. Deliberate backfill is different. That's when people actively fill a space. They don't just leave it and let nature do the job. They quarry material, carry it, dump it, sometimes in repeated episodes. The result, in the ground, has a different texture altogether. At Göbekli Tepe, the fill inside the main enclosures does not look like quiet, natural accumulation. When the excavators removed it, they found a kind of archaeological stew. Large and small limestone chunks mixed together, broken pieces of pillars and building stones, animal bones, flint flakes and tools, bits of plaster, organic material. It's not layered like windblown dust would be. It's jumbled and heterogeneous, as if many different types of debris were brought in from around the site and shoveled into the enclosures. Think about what that means. If a circle of pillars had simply collapsed over time, you'd expect to find big blocks slumped inward near where they originally stood, with finer material seeping in around them later. Instead, in many of Göbekli Tepe's enclosures, the standing pillars were found still rooted in their sockets, preserved up to several meters high, surrounded by this thick, mixed filler. The stones were not lying in random collapse piles at natural ground level. They were entombed. The composition of the fill is one clue. The way it's arranged in layers is another. Archaeologists read soil and stone the way historians read documents. They dig down through layers or strata and pay attention to how each one relates to the next. What lies on top of what cuts through what abuts what. This is stratigraphy. If filling happens slowly by natural means, you would expect lots of thin bands marking slight changes over time. A dark, organic, rich layer where plants grew for a while, a light, dusty band from a drier period, a lens of small stones from a minor collapse. Edges would be irregular. The contacts between layers would be wavy and eroded, because each one had time to weather before the next arrived. At Göbekli Tepe, many of the backfill layers look more like snapshots than a time-lapse. Within certain enclosures you see thick, relatively homogeneous layers of mixed debris resting sharply against the sides of pillars and walls. There aren't long sequences of alternating dust and soil horizons, as you'd expect if the site had slowly silted up over centuries of abandonment. Instead, there are big, discrete deposits, as if someone said, "Now we fill," and did a lot of it before stopping. In some places, the contacts between these layers are quite clear and crisp, suggesting distinct episodes of infilling rather than one single event or a completely continuous trickle. One layer of backfill may be cut by a small pit or feature, and then another layer laid on top of that. This tells us the burial was not a simple one-day job. It likely happened in several phases, maybe over generations, but each phase was still rapid compared to the slow drift of natural sediment. This brings us to the idea of sealed contexts. When an enclosure is deliberately filled and then not disturbed again, whatever lies beneath that fill is effectively sealed off from later activity. No one comes in to dig new pits, plant crops, build houses. The stratigraphic story ends at that moment of burial. For archaeologists, this is incredibly valuable. A sealed context is like a time capsule. The objects and surfaces under the backfill belong to the period when the enclosure was still open and in use. They haven't been churned up by later occupations or intrusions. The floor you see is the last floor. The tools and bones on it are the last ones dropped there before the space was closed. At Göbekli Tepe, the major enclosures appear to have been sealed in this way. Their interior fills, despite being made of mixed debris, are themselves capped and stable. Above them, later people did not build new monumental structures right on top of the old ones. Instead, the hill grew as layer after layer of infilled and abandoned architecture accumulated. For interpretation, this means we can separate before burial activity from everything that happened in the wider landscape afterward. Of course, not everyone agrees on exactly how to read the story written in these layers. Almost all researchers working on the site accept that the infill is largely anthropogenic, produced and placed by human hands rather than just by wind and rain. But the details are still debated. Was each enclosure buried more or less in one concentrated episode, maybe associated with a closure ritual? Or were the fills accumulated in many smaller backfilling events, each one tied to repairs, refurbishments, or changing uses of the space? Did different enclosures follow the same pattern? Or do some show signs of more gradual infill, perhaps blending deliberate dumping with natural processes? The timing is also a live question. Radiocarbon dates from materials inside the fills and on the last use surfaces don't always give a perfectly sharp cut-off. Organic bits can be older than the context they end up in. Some layers might represent secondary use of debris from earlier phases. So when we say they buried Göbekli Tepe, we're really talking about a drawn-out sequence of decisions that may have stretched across centuries, not one dramatic night with everyone shoveling by torchlight. Still, when you put the fill composition, the stratigraphy, and the sealed contexts together, a consistent picture emerges. This hill was not simply worn down and covered by chance. People gathered their own ruins and their own rubbish and used them to entomb the very spaces they had once laboured so hard to create. Why they did that, whether as a sacred closing act, a practical necessity, a social reorganization, or all of the above, that's where the real speculation begins. And to get there, we have to think about what it means, in a world before writing and cities, to deliberately close a place of gathering and turn it into a mound. In archaeology, this idea of closing a place isn't unique to Göbekli Tepe. Once you start looking for it, you see versions of it all over the world. Sometimes it's subtle, a final layer of carefully spread clean soil over a house floor before it's abandoned. A last hearth lit and then left with its ashes intact. A doorway deliberately blocked with stones. These are what archaeologists call termination or closure rituals, actions that mark the end of a building's life or a shrine's use in a way that's clearly more than just walking away. In Mesoamerica, temples were sometimes burned, then buried, and new temples built directly on top. The old sacred space wasn't simply demolished. It was entombed and then layered over, as if caught in amber inside the growing pyramid. In parts of prehistoric Europe, we see causewayed enclosures and ritual pits that end with a final distinctive deposit. Broken pots, animal bones, sometimes human remains, placed in a way that doesn't look like routine trash. The pattern is that when a community decides a place's role is over, they don't always erase it. Instead, they transform it. They send it off. Deliberate burial can do that in a very literal way. Think of burial as performing several tasks at once. On one level, it's practical. You fill a dangerous hollow, prevent collapse, stop animals from falling in, reclaim the surface. On another level, it's symbolic. By filling a space, you are finishing a sentence. You're saying this phase is complete, this relationship has ended or changed, for a sacred space that can be powerful. Once a structure is sealed, you cannot walk its floor again. You cannot stand in the old path of processions. You cannot touch the central pillar that your grandparents once touched. Its active life in the present is over. It moves into memory. But that memory is not erased, it's anchored. The mound remains at Göbekli Tepe. The fill does something like this on an enormous scale. Those pillars are not toppled, smashed beyond recognition, and hauled off. They are left standing, then wrapped in layers of stone, bone, and debris. The very act of burying preserves them in the exact positions that mattered when the site was alive. That's an odd way to treat a place you don't care about anymore. It's a very consistent way to treat a place whose physical presence you no longer want to use, but whose meaning you aren't willing to lose. When archaeologists talk about closure rituals here, they're looking at that combination of care and finality. The composition of the backfill, mixed refuse, animal bones, broken tools might sound anything but respectful. It sounds like trash, but trash can be ritual too. In many societies, the leftovers from feasts, offerings, and ceremonies become charged objects. They carry traces of the sacred events they were part of. Dumping them in a specific place isn't random disposal. It's concentrating that charged material. At Göbekli Tepe, the fill looks like a curated chaos. Not random soil, but a blend of debris from around the hill, flakes from toolmaking, bones from meals, fragments of older architecture. It may represent the accumulated byproducts of years of activity, swept up and folded back into the enclosure as part of its final use. If this is a closure scenario, the logic could run like this. The space has done its work. The rituals that once needed that open ring of pillars are no longer the rituals the community practices, or the people who led them are gone, or the social world has shifted. You don't simply let the sanctuary fall into ruin, vulnerable to storms, animals, or unsanctioned use. You gather the material traces of its heyday and bury the heart of it, so that what once stood between earth and sky now rests within the earth. Emotionally, that could serve several overlapping needs. Burying the enclosures might protect their sanctity. If the pillars carried spirits, ancestors, or powerful stories enclosing them, could have been a way to contain that power once it was no longer actively tended. A kind of spiritual quarantine. Not an act of hostility, but of caution. It might prevent misuse. Sacred places can attract rival claims or people who want to use them in ways the original community finds dangerous or wrong. By filling the spaces, you make casual access impossible. You transform them from living sanctuaries into ancestral foundations, still present, still important, but not available as a stage for everyday disputes. It might also mark transformation. Maybe the hill was once the main focus of regional gatherings, and later, as villages and early farms spread, new forms of ritual moved closer to everyday life. Burying the old centre could be a public way of saying, that world is ending. A new one is beginning. The mound becomes a monument to the time before. From this angle, the hill as we see it today would be a memory device, a landscape-scale memorial to a particular phase of belief and social organisation. Underneath each layer of fill, a chapter. Under each chapter, a circle of stones that no one was meant to stand among again. But we also have to be cautious. The same pattern of filling that looks like a grand termination ritual might, from another angle, look like long-term site management. If you're digging new enclosures on a sloping hill, at some point you're going to run into stability problems. Deep holes and standing pillars create hazards. One way to extend the life of the place is to backfill older, less used structures, turning them into solid platforms for later activity. In that scenario, the fill is practical engineering. You get a level surface, you reinforce subsiding areas, you control where people can move. Yet even then, in a world where the practical and the sacred are not neatly separated, the act of filling would still carry meaning, choosing what to use as fill, when to fill, and whether to leave the tops of pillars visible or bury them completely. These are decisions that could have been loaded with stories, taboos and prayers, even if they solved real architectural problems. So when we talk about Göbekli Tepe's burial as a closure ritual, it doesn't have to be a choice between purely symbolic and purely practical. It could easily have been both, a necessary technical solution wrapped in ceremony, or a sacred parting gesture carried out in a way that also stabilized the hill. The dirt doesn't tell us exactly what people felt as they shoveled it in. But the pattern, The rooted pillars, the curated fill, the sealed enclosures, does suggest that they were doing more than just cleaning up a ruin. They were finishing something. They were drawing a line. To understand what else might have pushed them toward that decision, we have to pull the camera back even further and look at the world around the hill, the climate, the changing landscape, and the pressures that can make even the most resilient traditions give way. When we zoom out from the hill itself and look at the wider world, the picture gets even more interesting. Göbekli Tepe was active during the early Holocene, roughly between 9,600 and 8,000 BCE. In global terms, that's just after the last ice age ended. Glaciers pulled back, sea levels rose, and climate systems reorganized. For Southwest Asia, this wasn't a simple "it got warmer and nicer" story. It was more like a series of steps, plateaus, and jolts. The general trend in the region was toward a warmer, wetter climate than the glacial period that came before. The so-called Fertile Crescent began to live up to its name. More stable rainfall in some zones, expanding grasslands, richer plant communities. But more stable doesn't mean calm. Early Holocene climate records from nearby lakes and cave deposits suggest swings in precipitation, periodic droughts, and short, cool snaps interrupting the overall warming. The famous 8.2 thousand year event, a sharp cooling and drying episode around 6,200 BCE, comes after Göbekli Tepe's main use. But there are earlier, smaller pulses too. So the people gathering on that hill were not living under a perfectly predictable sky. They were living inside a world that was trending better, but still twitchy. Now imagine what that does to your daily life if you're a hunter-forager in the uplands of southeastern Anatolia. Animals move with water and with plants. As rainfall patterns shift, game herds can change their migration routes, or their densities, or their timing. A valley that was once rich in gazelle might, over a few generations, become better for wild sheep instead. A spring that once ran year-round might turn seasonal. Patches of wild cereals might expand in good years and shrink dramatically in bad ones. Archaeologists studying animal bones from sites in the wider region see hints of exactly these kinds of transitions over the early Holocene. Changes in which species are most common, in the age profiles of hunted animals, in the balance between open country game and woodland species. We don't have a complete, continuous record from Göbekli Tepe itself yet, but what we do see suggests heavy hunting pressure on certain animals, gazelle in particular, and a broadening of the menu to include smaller, more varied species over time. That broadening can mean flexibility and skill. It can also be a sign that the most desirable high-yield animals were getting harder to rely on in the same way as before. Vegetation would have been shifting too. The early Holocene saw the spread of oak and pistachio woodlands across parts of the region, mixed with grasslands and patches of wild barley and wheat. For mobile groups, this mosaic could be a buffet if you know where and when to move. But changing rainfall and temperature can reorder that mosaic within a human lifetime. A familiar camping area might lose key plants. A new valley might suddenly be worth visiting every year. In a landscape like this, mobility is your main tool. You move to follow the best resources, you adjust the timing of your rounds. You meet other groups where paths naturally cross, near reliable springs along migration routes on prominent hills. Göbekli Tepe feels like one of those crossing points. But as climates continue to shift and as human populations grow and hunt more intensively, those older mobility patterns can start to strain. Maybe the gazelle migration that once synchronized with your annual gathering now comes earlier, or swings farther away. Maybe the best stands of wild grain are no longer near the hill, but in distant lowlands. Maybe some groups begin experimenting with tending certain patches of plants closer to their more permanent camps, slowly tipping the balance away from long-range pilgrimage and toward local investment. Climate stress doesn't have to be catastrophic to reshape culture. It can work quietly, by nudging calendars out of alignment. If your ritual schedule is tied to the appearance of certain animals or the ripening of certain plants, and those signs become less reliable, you have choices. You can adjust the ritual timing, you can change what the ritual is about, or you can shift where it happens, routing new ceremonies closer to the resources you now depend on. This is where climate and sacred architecture intersect. Large ritual gatherings like the ones Göbekli Tepe seems built for require cooperation across multiple groups. They demand surplus, enough food, time and labour to spare people from everyday tasks so they can carve pillars, prepare feasts and stay on the hill for days or weeks. In a period of relative abundance, those gatherings can grow, intensify, become the backbone of social life. But if climate variability squeezes your margins, if drought hits more often, or the key herds become less predictable, suddenly the cost of big, distant gatherings goes up. Under that kind of pressure, cooperation doesn't necessarily vanish, but it may reorganize. Instead of one grand hill drawing people from a wide radius, you might see smaller, more local ritual places emerging. Instead of enormous feasts every year, perhaps they become rarer or shift location to be closer to new resource hotspots. The very success of earlier gatherings might plant the seeds of new, more settled communities whose needs no longer match the old pattern. In that context, the burial of the Göbekli Tepe enclosures could be read as an adaptive strategy. Not we must hide this because of a single disaster, but our centre of gravity is moving. If more of everyday life, and even sacred life, is taking place nearer to emerging settlements, then climbing the hill to maintain costly stone circles might slowly make less sense. Burying them could be a way of consolidating, closing the chapter on one kind of regional gathering in order to invest energy elsewhere. The hill remains as an ancestral anchor, but the living rituals migrate with the shifting landscape. Or the decision could have been more direct. A series of lean years, water sources becoming fickle, game harder to find in the surrounding uplands. Leaders and elders might have interpreted those changes as a sign that the relationship between people, place, and powers had altered. The appropriate response might not be to abandon the sacred centre in shame, but to put it to sleep with care, just as you might ritually put to rest a house at the end of its life. Right now, these are possibilities, not proven stories. To firm them up, archaeologists would need several converging lines of evidence. Detailed paleo-environmental cores from lakes and wetlands around the region could show exactly how rainfall, vegetation and sedimentation changed during the centuries when Göbekli Tepe was active and then buried. Shifts from wetter to drier conditions, or changes in pollen from certain trees and grasses, could be matched against the occupational phases of the site. More fine-grained analysis of animal bones and plant remains from different layers within the enclosures and the surrounding areas could reveal whether there were gradual or sudden changes in what people were eating, hunting, and gathering. A decline in certain game species, or a rising emphasis on smaller, fast-reproducing animals, could hint at mounting hunting pressure or environmental stress. Isotopic studies on the bones, looking at seasonal signatures, might clarify when animals were being killed during the year. If the seasonality of feasting events shifted over time, that could reflect changes in migration patterns or in the timing of gatherings in response to climate rhythms. Combined, these kinds of data could tell us whether the burial of the enclosures lined up with a period of environmental tightening or with a reorientation in how people used the land. For now, what we can say is that Göbekli Tepe lived inside a changing climate and a changing landscape. Those slow, uneven pressures don't appear in stone the way carved foxes and vultures do, but they shape the background against which decisions are made. They can make some traditions harder to sustain, others more attractive, and can quietly tip the balance between keeping a hilltop sanctuary alive and tucking it beneath a mound. And as the landscape shifted, something else was stirring nearby. Experiments with plants and animals that would eventually transform the whole region. To understand why a community might bury its great stone circles and invest in something new, we have to follow those first steps into farming and settled life. Those first steps are visible in the ground, not very far from Göbekli Tepe. Within a day's walk of the hill, sites like Nevali Chori and later Chaioni show something Göbekli Tepe never really had: houses. Rectangular rooms, repeated plans, packed close together. Storage spaces, grinding stones worn down by years of daily use. Bones of sheep and goats that are no longer just wild visitors in the landscape, but animals whose age and sex profiles hint at human control. It doesn't happen all at once. Early on, people seem to be living in a mixed world. They still hunt wild gazelle and deer. They still gather wild cereals. But they also start tending certain stands of wheat and barley. Maybe they weed them. Maybe they resow seed over generations. The plants themselves change. Brittle seed heads that shatter in the wind give way to tougher ones that hold together until a human hand collects them. That's domestication written quietly into plant anatomy. The same slow shift shows up in animals. At first, herds look wild, a broad mix of ages and both sexes being hunted. Later, we see more young males being killed and more adult females being kept alive. That's a signature of herd management. People are no longer just following the animals. They're reshaping the herd. As these domestication trajectories unfold, the rhythm of daily life changes. If you're managing fields and flocks, your calendar is tied to them. You can't simply move because the gazelle didn't show this year. You have seedlings in the ground. You have pregnant ewes that need shelter. You're invested in a particular valley, a particular slope, a particular spring. Labour reorganizes around that investment. Instead of bursts of intense collective work to build stone enclosures and stage massive feasts once or twice a year, more energy flows into routine tasks: sowing, weeding, harvesting, grinding, feeding, repairing houses, tending newborn animals. Diet shifts too. Wild game and gathered plants are gradually joined, and in some places overtaken by cereals and domestic meat. The menu becomes more predictable, but also narrower, more dependent on a few key species and a few critical seasons. Risk changes its shape. Mobile foragers spread risk across space. If one valley fails, you move to another. Early farmers spread risk across time. You gamble on the coming harvest, on the survival of your herd through winter, on your ability to store enough grain to bridge lean months. Hunger becomes less about day-to-day luck, and more about whether a few crucial weeks of rain or a disease outbreak in your animals goes your way. In that world, the kind of large, region-wide gathering centre represented by Göbekli Tepe may simply fit less well. New economic realities can quietly erode the need for an old kind of monument. If your social life is now anchored in a village, where your cousins live next door, and your in-laws across the lane, you don't need to travel to a distant hill as often to renew alliances. Marriage ties, labour exchanges and feasting can happen in and between settlements. The village itself becomes the stage for identity and obligation. When we compare Göbekli Tepe to nearby Neolithic sites that come just a little later, the shift is striking. At Göbekli Tepe, architecture is overwhelmingly non-domestic: monumental enclosures, towering T-pillars, no clear houses. The space is specialised, devoted to rituals we don't fully understand, but that certainly required planning and coordination beyond a single family. At Nevali Chori, you still see T-shaped pillars, but now they stand inside rectangular buildings that look much more like houses or communal rooms. Ritual and daily life share walls, At Cheonu, architecture develops into densely packed neighbourhoods, with some buildings clearly set apart as special, but most of the effort going into living spaces, work areas and facilities like drainage and storage. It's as if the priorities invert. At Göbekli Tepe, sacred architecture dominates, and any domestic life is offstage. In the emerging villages, domestic architecture dominates, and the sacred is tucked inside it, or into a few select buildings. One way to think about this is through the idea of social technology. Before villages stabilise, when groups are still relatively mobile and alliances need to stretch across hills and valleys, a big, impressive ritual centre is a powerful tool. It's a technology for making cooperation visible and durable. The stones don't move, so your commitments to each other feel less likely to drift. You gather, feast, tell stories, arrange marriages, resolve disputes. The monument is an engine that keeps scattered groups plugged into a shared world. Once people begin living year-round in the same place, with shared walls and shared fields, some of that work can be done by the village itself. Daily interaction replaces occasional pilgrimage. Regular small feasts replace rare huge ones. Rules can be enforced by neighbours and elders who see you every morning, not just by whatever powers are invoked on a distant hill. In that sense, Göbekli Tepe's great circles may have been an early form of social technology that became less necessary as a different technology. The permanent village matured. If that's true, then the burial of the enclosures isn't just about climate or a single crisis. It's a sign of institutional transition. Old structures, both physical and social, are being retired to make room for new ones. The hill that once anchored far-flung bands is carefully put to sleep as houses, storage rooms, and smaller local shrines take over its functions. The community doesn't necessarily reject what the place meant. They absorb it, translate it into village life, and cover the old machinery of cohesion with earth. Seen this way, the backfilling of Göbekli Tepe is less an act of hiding and more an act of handing over. Authority, ritual, and identity are moving from towering pillars under open sky into doorways, hearths, and courtyards. The stone circles become ancestors to a new order, buried but not forgotten. Of course, reorganizing society is rarely smooth. As fields expand and villages grow, new kinds of stress emerge, over land, over access to water, over who controls the rituals that now take place in more settled communities. And that opens another possible reason to bury a powerful hilltop sanctuary, not just because it was no longer needed, but because in a changing world it might have become dangerous to leave it standing. Dangerous how? When people settle down, tension stops being something that flares up and then walks away. It sticks. It has an address, a field boundary, a spring, a path between two villages, and under those conditions a hilltop that once united many groups can start to look less like neutral ground and more like a prize. Think about what Göbekli Tepe actually is, in social terms. It's a place where multiple groups probably gathered, a place where stories were told, alliances renewed, marriages arranged, obligations remembered. Whoever had the right to call the gathering, to decide the timing, to speak first inside the enclosures that wasn't just ritual prestige. That was political power, in a very early, very small-scale sense. In anthropology, there's a simple rule of thumb. Whoever can organize the feast tends to organize the people. If one lineage or one cluster of villages began to claim Göbekli Tepe as theirs more than others, that could create friction. Maybe control over the hill became a way to claim authority over hunting territories, or over access to certain herds, or over marriage partners who normally circulated between groups. Maybe some people felt shut out. Maybe others pushed back. We don't have a written record of any of this. What we do have is a sense from comparative cases of how ritual spaces behave when societies start to scale up and settle down. In a lot of early farming worlds, big, shared sacred sites become arenas where competition plays out. Not necessarily with armies, but with rival processions, rival lineages, rival claims to be the real custodians of tradition. Archaeologists sometimes call this ritual politics. It's soft power, but it can harden quickly. If that kind of tension was brewing around Göbekli Tepe, burying the enclosures could be read as a way to step out of the fight entirely. One possibility, backfilling as protection. Not protection from invaders in the classical sense. We're thousands of years before city walls and marching armies here, but protection from something more intimate. From a neighbouring group repurposing your ancestors' sanctuary. From rivals recarving images, erecting new pillars that overwrite your stories with theirs. From the slow creep of someone else's rights into your sacred ground. Filling the enclosures to the top with rubble and refuse is a very effective way of making them unusable very quickly. No one can easily come in and set up their own ceremonies. No one can rearrange the pillars without enormous effort. If your fear is that a once neutral sanctuary will be captured and turned into a rival's headquarters, then sealing it might be the cleanest solution. There's also the possibility of simple desecration anxiety. If a place is deeply associated with powerful beings, with ancestors, with binding oaths, then leaving it abandoned and open could feel dangerous. Not just spiritually, but socially. If hostile people trample it, deface it, leave their trash in the centre, what does that say about your group's ability to protect what matters? Burial in that frame is not hiding. It's safeguarding. A final act of stewardship. If we can't care for this place properly anymore, we will at least ensure that no one else can abuse it. But before we lean too far into narratives of conflict, it's important to be clear about what we don't see. If Göbekli Tepe had been violently attacked, there are certain things archaeologists would expect to find. Human remains with sharp force trauma or embedded projectiles. Skeletons left in unusual positions, not carefully placed burials, but bodies abandoned where they fell. Burn layers cutting across the site, showing widespread fire that isn't part of ordinary cleaning or cooking. Hasty fortifications, ditches, ramparts, walls that cut off access in a rush, rather than the low surrounding wall that seems to define, not defend, the hill. So far, none of that has turned up in a clear, site-wide way. That doesn't mean there was never interpersonal violence. Any human community has arguments, assaults, maybe even occasional killings. It simply means we don't have good evidence for a dramatic, climactic battle for the hill. The backfill looks deliberate, organised and repeated, not like the debris of a massacre or a burned-out shrine. What we're really talking about then is more subtle, the politics of who gets to gather where. In small-scale societies, a common pattern emerges. There are places considered neutral, where disputes are set aside and everyone behaves. Over time, though, the neutrality of those places can erode. A particular family might begin providing more of the food. A particular village might be closer or more numerous. Ritual roles, who slaughters the animals, who speaks to the spirits, might start clustering in one group's hands. At that point, a shared sacred site isn't just about the supernatural anymore. It's about networks. Who controls the calendar of gatherings? Who mediates disputes? Who uses the stone circles as a stage to display generosity, bravery, or wealth? Archaeologists sometimes frame this as the central place problem. Central places can knit a region together, but they can also become levers for inequality. Göbekli Tepe sits right at the moment when those dynamics could have begun to bite. People still moved, but less than before. Villages were emerging. Fields and flocks anchored families to specific patches of land. Alliances mattered more, but so did rivalry. Through that lens, the burial of the enclosures can be seen as a kind of political neutralization. By filling them in, the communities around the hill might have been saying, "No one gets to own this anymore. No lineage, no village, no ambitious ritual specialist can turn these spaces into their exclusive base of power." The authority once focused here dissolves back into multiple settlements, multiple smaller shrines, multiple feasting places. It's a move we see echoes of much later in history. Powerful relics walled up, not destroyed but taken out of circulation, contested temples deliberately closed, cult statues buried rather than left for enemies to capture. Of course, with Göbekli Tepe, all of this is inference, not proof. The stones don't come with minutes from a council meeting where someone proposed Project Backfill as a conflict resolution strategy. What we can say is that the timing makes sense. As farming and villages rise, as new stresses over land and water appear, a pan-regional sanctuary becomes both less necessary and more politically loaded. In that transformed landscape, putting the old hill to sleep may have been the safest way to keep it from becoming a weapon. And even if no open struggle ever occurred, the mere possibility might have been enough. Sometimes the most enduring acts of peace are the ones that quietly remove the sharpest tools from the table before anyone has a chance to grab them. There's another layer to all this that's easy to miss if we only think in terms of myth, politics, and symbolism. Stone, actual, physical stone, sitting on a windy hilltop for centuries. If you've ever walked around a ruined church or a medieval castle, or even an old dry stone wall in the countryside, you know that big impressive structures don't just stand there forever on their own. They lean, they crack, they sink, they slip downhill grain by grain. Göbekli Tepe wasn't carved yesterday. Each enclosure seems to have had a life. A phase of building, a period of use, and then decisions about what to do when the materials or the ground beneath them started to fail. Look at how those T-pillars are set up. They're not just standing on bare rock. Many of them are socketed into shallow pits, surrounded by packing material with low stone walls linking them into circles. The floors we see today are mostly compacted deposits, some plastered, some trampled earth. All of that is vulnerable. Rain soaks in, wind erodes edges. People walking around the same paths for decades grind surfaces smooth, then hollow. Freeze-thaw cycles in winter seasons can wedge tiny cracks wider with ice. Small movements add up. A pillar that was perfectly stable when first set might, generations later, be slightly tilted. One that was once well braced might now be resting on fill that has settled, or washed out around the edges. When you're standing under a many-ton limestone slab, slightly tilted is not a trivial detail. One very down-to-earth possibility is that, at least in some phases, people at Göbekli Tepe were dealing with an engineering problem. These things are starting to move. We actually have hints of this in the way some enclosures were modified. Later walls slice across earlier layouts. Pillars are reused or supplemented. Low buttressing and extra stonework appear around certain uprights. It looks in places like a constant process of adjustment, propping, reinforcing, patching over. If you imagine a sanctuary used over multiple generations, you can imagine the conversations. Someone notices a hairline crack at the base of a pillar. Someone else points out a dip in the floor where water always collects after rain. A minor stonefall in one season might provoke urgent concern about the health of the place. In that context, deliberately piling rubble and earth around the pillars starts to look less like a mysterious act of ritual vandalism and more like something very practical, backfilling as stabilization. If you surround a wobbling post with tightly packed stones and sediment, you spread the load. You change how it can move. You effectively turn a free standing column into a buried post held firm by the material around it. The same logic works on hillsides. If you want to stop erosion eating away at a slope, You can terrace it with stone, or you can bury vulnerable edges under a thicker, more compact mass. From this angle, filling an enclosure up to the top could have started as a safety measure. Not necessarily all at once, not necessarily to the very rim initially, but as a cumulative response. More fill to steady that base, more to firm up that wall, more to level that sagging floor. And yet, even if it began as practical engineering, it wouldn't have felt merely practical to the people doing it. In a lot of societies, especially ones without a sharp divide between sacred and secular work, maintenance is ritual. Plastering a floor can be a ceremony. Repainting a shrine can involve offerings and songs. Rebuilding a roof can be timed to particular days, embedded in origin stories, loaded with taboos about who can touch what. Ethnographers have documented temple communities where cleaning the sanctuary is a sacred duty, where even the act of sweeping is framed as feeding the gods or renewing the world. There's no contradiction between, we're doing this so the roof doesn't fall on our heads, and we're doing this because the spirits require it. Both can be true at once. So it's not hard to picture a similar blending at Göbekli Tepe. Maybe the first layers of rubble were justified as strengthening the house of the beings or giving the ancestors more earth to stand in. Maybe the infill was poured in stages, each associated with a renewal rite, new plaster, fresh backfill, offerings folded into the material, bones, tools, fragments of earlier carvings, like a kind of spiritual concrete. Over time, the line between repair and retirement could blur. If every major structural intervention is also a ritual act, then at some point, the biggest possible structural intervention, filling the whole thing to the brim, might be the ultimate ritual. This is where the speed and thoroughness of the final backfill becomes important. Archaeologists working at the site have noted that some enclosures appear to have been filled rapidly with relatively loose, heterogeneous material, broken stone, animal bones, debris, layered in ways that don't look like slow wind-blown accumulation. It looks organised, but not like decades of casual dumping. More like deliberate campaigns of infilling. If the goal had only been maintenance, we might expect more selective packing, targeted support around bases, retaining walls against erosion, limited fill to stabilise critical points while keeping the interior mostly usable. Instead, we see spaces rendered unusable for standing, walking or assembling, all in one go. That pushes us toward a hybrid interpretation. Perhaps the community had long experience using fill to keep the pillars steady and the floors workable. Perhaps they knew in a quiet, empirical way that buried stone doesn't fall on you. Then, at some decision point, triggered by social tensions, by shifts in settlement, by a new way of relating to the old hill, they took that familiar, practical technique and scaled it up into a final act. Fill as safety against collapse, fill as defence against erosion, fill as a way of making sure that whatever forces were believed to inhabit the place stayed calm, enclosed, literally grounded, and fill as a way of saying, ceremonially, this chapter is over. In that light, the burying of Göbekli Tepe stops being a choice between it was just engineering and it was pure ritual. The categories themselves may be misleading. For the people who hauled those baskets of stone, the work could have been all of those things at once: caretaking, hazard management, piety, and farewell. And once you accept that the same action can carry both functional and symbolic weight, it becomes easier to tackle the last, nagging question that pulls at modern imaginations. If they went to all this trouble to fill it so carefully, what exactly were they putting out of reach? When people see something like Göbekli Tepe, huge stones, strange animals, a whole complex deliberately buried, the modern mind tends to jump to the same dramatic question: what were they hiding? For some, that question immediately blossoms into a familiar set of answers. A lost civilization with high technology, a vanished race, teaching hunter-gatherers their secrets. Maybe even visitors from somewhere else in the cosmos, dropping in, leaving a stone business card, then vanishing into the night. Those ideas stick for a reason. They're cinematic. They're easy to picture. A hidden engine room under the hill. A sealed chamber with metal tools that don't rust. A code in the carvings that only makes sense if you already believe in star maps and flying machines. But when archaeologists talk about Göbekli Tepe, they have to start from a different rule of thumb. Extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence. Not just interesting evidence, or you could maybe interpret it this way if you squint evidence. The kind of evidence that would force even skeptical specialists to say, all right, the old picture is broken, we need a new one. Imagine what that would actually look like. If there had been advanced metalworking here, we'd expect slag from smelting, broken tools, microscopic traces of high-temperature furnaces. Not one or two anomalies, but patterned, repeatable finds across multiple layers. If there had been machines, we'd expect standardized parts, wear patterns, residues that don't match stone, wood, bone, or simple plant fibers. We'd expect manufacturing waste, offcuts, mistakes, prototypes. If there had been a literate civilization with writing, we'd expect repeated signs or symbols that behave like a script. Same marks, same clusters, turning up in different places on different objects in predictable arrangements. We'd expect transitional pieces, half image, half inscription, the archaeological equivalents of draft pages. So far, Göbekli Tepe doesn't show any of that. What we see instead is stone carving pushed about as far as stone carving can go, when your tools are also stone. We see flint blades, grinding stones, bone tools. We see animal bones from feasts, fragments of figurines, piles of rubble moved by human hands. We see skill, patience, planning. We don't see anything that demands a lost high-tech culture to explain it. That doesn't mean everything is simple, or that the story is complete. It just sets a baseline. Before we ask what they were hiding, we have to admit how much we still don't actually know without jumping several steps ahead to spaceships. There are real mysteries here, hiding in plain sight. We still haven't found the settlement that matches the scale of the site. A place like Göbekli Tepe doesn't run on thin air. People need to sleep, cook, nurse babies, nap flint, repair clothing. They need middens, hearths, water sources. Some of that everyday life is starting to appear in the wider region, other sites, smaller structures. But the capital city some imagine right next to the hill just hasn't turned up yet. That gap feels strange. It invites stories. The same goes for social hierarchy. A project like this needs organizers. People who can say, we're going to spend the dry season hauling pillars, and somehow make others agree. But we don't yet see palaces or individual graves dripping with luxury items that scream king. Power may have been real, but it's not leaving the kind of archaeological fingerprints we're used to from later civilizations. Then there's the symbolic system carved into the stone. Foxes, snakes, vultures, abstract signs, combinations that repeat in some places and not in others. It clearly meant something to the people who carved it. Maybe an origin story, maybe a calendar, maybe a charter of how the world is structured. But we don't have the key. We can say these images are clustered. These arrangements recur. These animals are favoured in certain enclosures. But we can't read them like a text. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Add one more layer of uncertainty. The site itself isn't fully excavated. What we see in photographs, the famous enclosures, the standing pillars, that's only part of the mound. Geophysical surveys suggest many more circular structures still buried under the soil. Work proceeds slowly, carefully, because every layer you remove is gone forever. That slowness is good archaeology, but it also leaves big patches of blank map for outside imaginations to colour in. When you know there are untouched chambers under the hill, it's easy to fantasize. Maybe that's where the alien engine core is. Maybe that's where the proof of a lost super-civilization lies. As long as the spades haven't reached it, any story can be projected into that darkness. Speculation loves empty spaces, but we don't have to fill those spaces with hidden gadgets to keep the sense of wonder alive. There's another kind of hiding that fits more closely with how many traditional societies actually work. Not hiding technology, hiding meaning. In a lot of cultures, sacred knowledge is layered. There's what everyone sees, and then there's what only some people are allowed to know. Myths with public versions and secret versions, rituals that look one way from the outside, but carry very different messages for the initiated. Information itself can be dangerous. Names of spirits, details of origin stories, correct sequences of ritual steps. These aren't just trivia. They're power. They can be restricted, guarded, withheld. Viewed from that angle, burying Göbekli Tepe might not be about concealing an object. It might be about closing a chapter of knowledge, locking in a particular way of relating to animals, to ancestors, to the sky, making sure that a certain configuration of power or story or identity could no longer be casually walked into by anyone passing by. The pillars once open become sealed. The images once visible are entombed in darkness. The hill, once a specific set of enclosures, becomes a smooth, anonymous mound. They didn't have to be hiding a machine to be hiding something. They could have been hiding a relationship, a contract with the world that no longer fit the new age of farming villages and changing alliances. A symbolic code that only made sense for people who still lived mostly from wild herds and wild plants. When that world began to fade, maybe the stories that anchored it had to be safely put away too, honoured, contained, and then literally covered over. What were they hiding? Maybe not a lost technology, but a way of being human, that they themselves decided should sink back into the earth. If Göbekli Tepe is a way of being human that was finally put away, it's worth asking a much more grounded, but no less astonishing question. How did that way of being actually work day to day? Because nothing about this place is casual. You don't accidentally shape multi-ton pillars, arrange them into circular enclosures, carve them with detailed reliefs, then later fill those same spaces with tons of rubble, layer after layer, by mistake. Behind the mystery of meaning, there's the very practical mystery of logistics. Start with the people themselves. To raise even a single enclosure, you need more than a handful of foragers passing through. You need quarry teams, working the bedrock on the hillside. People who understand how to read the stone, where to cut, how to avoid fractures that would ruin months of effort. You need carvers with the patience and eye to turn rough blocks into smooth T-shapes and animal figures with flowing lines. Then you need haulers. Moving a 10, 20 or even 40-ton pillar from quarry to enclosure isn't a solo activity. It's dozens of bodies, maybe more, coordinated around ropes, sledges or rollers. People pushing, pulling, levering, chanting, taking turns. Some stabilizing the load, some clearing the path, some watching for cracks or slips. And above all of them, you need planners. Not necessarily kings in crowns, but someone or some small group able to think in seasons, not just days. To say when the herds move through in spring, we'll hunt and dry meat. When the grains ripen, we'll gather. When the heat drops and people can spend long days on the hill without collapsing, that's when we carve, that's when we haul, that's when we set the next pair of pillars. It's easy to picture this like a construction company without paperwork. Informal but not unorganized. Knowledge held in heads rather than in blueprints. A kind of mental spreadsheet of who's coming, what they can do, what needs to be ready when they arrive. And that leads straight into food. A project of this scale doesn't run on belief alone. It runs on calories. The animal bones found at Göbekli Tepe aren't just random leftovers from a few evening meals. They come from many individuals, often wild game like gazelle and aurochs. They're burned, broken, processed in ways that suggest large episodes of butchering and cooking. Not 2 or 3 people sharing a haunch over a fire, but many people gathering for a major event. Feasts. In small-scale societies, feasting is never just about eating. It's about obligation and memory. You travel to a central place. You contribute animals, labor special foods. In return, you receive hospitality, stories, status. Debts are created and settled. Marriages arranged. Alliances renewed, gossip traded. If Göbekli Tepe functioned as a kind of regional ritual centre, feasts could have been the engine that powered the building. You're not just asking people to spend days hauling stone for nothing. You're inviting them to a gathering everyone expects, tied to the turning of the year or the movements of the sky. Part of that gathering is ritual. Part of it is eating more meat in a few days than you might see in weeks at home. Part of it is the shared pride of saying, we helped raise that pillar. That enclosure is ours too. Food becomes social glue. Labour becomes a way of performing belonging. From this angle, the economics of Göbekli Tepe aren't about coins or taxes. They're about a flow of meat, grain, time and prestige. The hill is both a sacred place and a gigantic machine for turning dispersed forager groups into a coordinated workforce, at least for a while, once or twice a year. Then there are the tools in their hands, no copper chisels, no iron crowbars, just stone against stone, wood, bone and fibre. Archaeologists find flint blades so sharp they can still cut skin today. They find heavy hammerstones scarred from repeated impacts, grinding stones pitted by hours of friction. Simple, yes, but in skilled hands, terrifyingly effective. To detach a pillar from the bedrock, workers could have followed natural fissures, pecking and carving a trench around the outline. Wooden wedges tapped into cracks, then soaked with water, would slowly expand, helping to lift the stone free. Levering bars, tough branches or trunks, could shift the weight centimetre by centimetre. Once freed, the pillar might be laid onto sledges of wood or dragged across the ground on a bed of logs. The idea of rollers isn't science fiction here, it's basic physics, rediscovered by many cultures independently. With enough people pulling on ropes, twisted plant fibres, animal sinew, you can move more than any one person could dream. To tilt a pillar upright into its socket, you don't need cranes. You need ramps of earth and stone, carefully built. You raise the base end a little, pack in support, raise again, pack again, until the standing position is almost reached. Then let gravity complete the final drop. None of this demands hidden advanced technology, but it does demand something perhaps just as impressive, generations of accumulated experience. Because when you look closely at the pillars, the repetition jumps out. Not just in the symbols, but in the craft. The T-shapes across multiple enclosures share proportions. The hands carved on some of the central pillars follow the same conventions. Belt motifs, fox pelts, draped around the waists, V-shaped features. These elements aren't random experiments. They belong to a style. Style means teaching somewhere, probably not far from the hill. Children and teenagers were learning to knap flint without shattering it, to abrade limestone without gouging it, to outline an animal so its muscles feel tense, its posture alive, instead of flat and clumsy. Apprenticeship doesn't leave direct traces the way a pillar does, but it's implied by consistency. If different groups from all over the region were contributing, and yet the carved forms look like they belong to the same school, then someone was setting standards, correcting mistakes, saying, "No, the shoulders go like this." When a new enclosure began, the community wasn't starting from zero. They were drawing on a library of techniques, a mental archive of what had worked before. Each new circle of pillars was both a fresh ritual space and a demonstration that the tradition of craft was still alive. And that brings us back to the burial. If you have the organisational capacity to coordinate quarry teams, carvers, haulers, seasonal feasts, and craft training over generations, then deliberately burying the site stops looking like an impossible stretch. It starts to look like the last phase in a very long project. The same planners who could say, "This winter we raise those 2 pillars," could also one day say, "This year we close this enclosure." The same networks that mobilized people for feasts and building could mobilize them for filling. The same skills used to move stone into place could be used, in reverse, to pack rubble and soil into every available gap. In that sense, the burial isn't an anomaly. It's the final use of a system that had already proven it could move mountains, slowly with bare hands. A system of cooperation, of shared meals, of remembered techniques and repeated journeys to a hill that, by the time they chose to cover it, had already shaped who they were for centuries. Göbekli Tepe can feel so singular that it's easy to forget something important. It wasn't alone. If you zoom out from that one hill, the landscape around it starts to light up with other places, other stone circles, other carved pillars. Not as big, not as famous, not as deeply excavated, but clearly part of the same world. Archaeologists call them Göbekli-type sites, which is a very technical way of saying cousins. Karahan Tepe, Sefer Tepe, Hamzan Tepe, Çakmak Tepe. New names appearing almost every few years as surveys continue. Many of them sit on similar ridgelines, with views over broad valleys. Many of them have their own T-shaped pillars, their own enclosures, their own carved animals and abstract signs. None of them are identical, but they rhyme. At Karahan Tepe, for example, you find pillars that look like they could have been sculpted by the same minds that worked Göbekli Tepe. 2 forms, smooth surfaces, careful proportions. There's even a sunken room with pillars rising from the floor like a stone forest. Different layout, same language, across the region. Certain motifs repeat. Snakes, foxes, wild boar, birds, the abstract H-like signs, ladders, crescents and circles. Sometimes they're arranged differently. Sometimes they're paired with new elements. But the vocabulary is shared. That doesn't happen by accident. If one little band of foragers had dreamed up Göbekli Tepe all on their own, you might expect its style to die with them. An isolated experiment here and gone. But that's not what the archaeology shows. Instead, you have multiple hills, multiple ritual centres, scattered over tens of kilometres, all built in roughly the same era, all drawing on the same basic toolkit of forms. That suggests 2 things at once: local autonomy and regional tradition. Each community brings its own twist, its own preferred animals, its own layout. But everyone seems to agree on the fundamentals: upright T-pillars, arranged in special spaces, a shared canon of images, a sense that these places matter enough to shape stone into permanent forms. You can think of it like dialects of the same sacred language. Just as the bottlenecked humans you heard about earlier spread out and diversified, yet stayed connected enough to share ideas and genes, these early farming-age foragers seem to have done something similar with their sacred architecture. Small groups, scattered but not isolated, meeting each other, trading, intermarrying, perhaps competing, and every so often travelling to the same hills. That's where the idea of pilgrimage starts to make sense. If Göbekli Tepe is one node in a network, it doesn't have to carry the whole ritual burden alone. Multiple communities might have had their own home shrines closer to their daily territories, smaller enclosures where local rituals took place, where nearby groups met more frequently. But once in a while, on a different rhythm, perhaps tied to constellations or seasonal extremes, people might have walked farther. Days of travel, following riverbeds and ridgelines, to reach the bigger hill, the one everyone knew about, the one with the tallest pillars, the richest carvings, the deepest traditions. In that model, Göbekli Tepe doesn't stand alone. It sits at the top of a hierarchy. Village shrines, if we can call them that, at the bottom. Regional centres like Karahan Tepe in the middle, and then perhaps one or two places, Göbekli Tepe among them, that functioned almost like pan-regional pilgrimage destinations. When you read the animal bones and stone tools with that in mind, they start to look like the archaeological shadow of traffic. People coming from different directions, bringing slightly different tool styles, cooking in the same hearths, leaving their waste in the same fills. The shared motifs on pillars across sites tell a similar story of movement, not just of bodies, but of ideas. If a carver at Karahan Tepe is scratching out the same peculiar H-shaped symbol as someone at Göbekli Tepe, that symbol has travelled. It has been copied, learned, transmitted, maybe along with a story, a myth, a warning. We don't have the words, but the persistence of the sign hints at a story stable enough to move between groups. That's what cultural exchange looks like when you strip away writing, patterns that keep reappearing over distance. It also gives us another way to think about the burial. If Göbekli Tepe exists inside a whole constellation of related sites, then closing it doesn't mean stepping out of the sacred universe altogether. It might mean shifting focus in a pilgrimage network. Centers rise and fall. A water source changes. A new hill is cleared. A charismatic ritual specialist dies at one place and is replaced at another. Trade routes bend. A settlement becomes more permanent. Over generations, the main place people go to can drift, even while the overall tradition continues. So imagine a world where Göbekli Tepe was once the brightest star in that sacred sky. People travelled far to reach it. Feasts were held there. Myths were anchored to its stones, but then gradually other nodes gained weight. Karahan Tepe, with its own enclosures and peculiar subterranean room, might begin to host bigger events. Another hill, with better access to emerging farmlands, might attract more regular gatherings. As cultivation spreads, as herds become more managed, the ideal location for a central ritual site could change, inch by inch. Maybe more people start living year-round in villages down in the valleys. Maybe those communities create new kinds of sacred spaces closer to home. Rectangular buildings, indoor rituals, altars inside houses. The anchor points of meaning migrate. From this regional point of view, Göbekli Tepe's burial could be read less as an isolated drama and more as a managed transition, closing one node, consciously, respectfully, as others take over its role. If the same networks of cooperation that once channeled people to Göbekli Tepe are now channeling them elsewhere, then covering the old hill might serve several purposes at once. It preserves the memory of what was there, protecting the pillars from weathering and from casual disturbance, while clearly signalling, this chapter is finished. Go there now, not here. A regional sacred landscape also helps test the different theories you've heard about why the site was buried. If climate stress alone had forced abandonment, you might expect a broad collapse of ritual building across the region. But instead we see continuity and variation, other sites active, newer traditions emerging. If fear of some local disaster had driven people to hide the stones, we might expect matching signs of panic elsewhere. So far, that's not what the broader pattern seems to show. What the network does seem to show is evolution, not in genes this time, but in sacred geography. Early on, many groups might have converged on the same few hills. Over time, as social and economic life shifted, more farming, more settled living, more local shrines, those big early centres, could become less central. Their closure would be less about erasing something terrible and more about acknowledging that its heyday had passed. In that sense, Göbekli Tepe's burial might be one moment in a long series of adjustments. A way of saying with stone and soil instead of words, this place brought us together when we were different people, living different lives. It did its work. Now our lives have changed. The network will continue, but the path through it will be different. And somewhere on another hill, new pillars were already standing. So how do you actually close a hill like that? Not as an idea, as a job. Archaeologically, what we see at Göbekli Tepe isn't random collapse or slow silting. It's deliberate infilling. Enclosures that were once open to the sky are packed tight with a very specific kind of material. Broken stone, rubble, animal bones, flint tools, bits of worked limestone, pieces of pillars, and plain old soil. Layer upon layer, inside spaces that had once been carefully curated. From that, you can start to imagine a sequence. First, there's clearing. If these enclosures were used over generations, they wouldn't have been pristine when the decision came to close them. Imagine floors scattered with charcoal from old fires, dropped beads, broken tools, animal bones from earlier feasts. Plants might have begun to creep in. Dust and leaves would accumulate. So perhaps the first act isn't adding anything, it's taking things away. People move through the circles, lifting leftover hearth stones, pulling out rotten wooden posts, removing whatever is considered too sacred or too personal to be buried. Maybe amulets, favourite tools, certain decorated skulls or figurines. You can picture hands brushing dust from carved foxes and snakes one last time. Someone running fingers along the relief of a vulture, tracing lines they've known since childhood. Quiet talk, decisions about what stays and what goes. Then comes the choice. These pillars, these carved stones, are not going with the people. They're staying. Now the deposit begins. The fill at Göbekli Tepe isn't just the dirt right outside the walls, scraped in lazily. It's a mix of materials that seem to have been brought from different parts of the site, maybe even from beyond it. Stone chips from carving episodes, refuse from feasts. Broken tools, the everyday byproducts of life and ritual. That suggests a second phase, gathering. Groups move around the slopes of the hill, and maybe around nearby camps, collecting debris. They dig into rubbish heaps, quarry spoil, old working floors. They bring baskets of stone flakes and animal bones. They break larger blocks down into pieces they can carry. Every load becomes future sediment. You can imagine a low, constant rhythm. Footsteps on stone, the scrape of baskets set down, the muffled thud as rubble is tipped over the enclosure walls. A hill that once rang with carving and chanting now fills with the quieter sounds of labour. Inside the circles, the process would have a pattern. You don't just dump everything in a heap and walk away. If you want those high central pillars to remain standing under the weight of tons of fill, you need to pack it carefully. Archaeologists talk about structured fill, layers that aren't completely random, stones placed so they interlock, voids minimized. That implies people inside the enclosures, moving the material around, stomping it down, arranging larger stones as supports. So the third phase is packing. Picture small teams working within the ring of pillars, while others pass baskets down from above. The space is tight. The pillars loom over you, slowly shrinking as the floor effectively rises. With each new layer, the acoustics change. Sound becomes more enclosed, more muffled. Voices echo differently. They might have done it in stages. One possibility is a single huge closure event, A generation decides now, and over a single season or a few years, an enclosure is systematically filled, levelled and sealed. That would feel like a one-time funeral for the whole space. But there's another model that fits the evidence just as well: staged burial. An enclosure might first be used, then partially filled after some major ritual, leaving the tops of the pillars still visible. Decades later, another infilling event raises the surface higher. Over centuries, multiple episodes of fill build up until the space is completely packed and level with the surrounding slope. In that version, the burial isn't one dramatic moment. It's a repeated gesture, a kind of rhythm: use, close a little, use, close more, finally, close altogether. Archaeologists do see differences in the fill, variations in contents and compaction that could reflect separate episodes. It's hard to be certain, but the stratigraphy leaves room for the idea that burial was itself a long tradition, not a single act. Whichever model you favour, somebody had to do the work. Was it everyone, or a few? A site like Göbekli Tepe could mobilise a lot of bodies when needed: families from surrounding valleys, visitors from sister hills, people attached by kinship and story. The excavation record hints at mass events in its active days: big feasts, lots of animal slaughter, tool production on an industrial scale. Closing an enclosure might have piggybacked on that same network. In a community-wide version, you can imagine a gathering called specifically for this purpose. People arriving with their own baskets and tools, each group contributing labour as a kind of obligation or honour. Workdays broken up by shared meals, songs or chants used to keep rhythm as lines of people pass stone and rubble from hand to hand. The burial itself becomes ceremony, or the opposite. Maybe only certain people are allowed inside the circles once the decision to close them is made. Ritual specialists, particular lineages, initiates of a cult. Ordinary visitors might see only the outcome: the enclosure they once entered now rising as a flat, clean mound, access restricted. In that model, the outer work, hauling rubble up the slope, breaking stone, is generalized, but the inner work, deciding what goes where, overseeing the last rituals around each pillar, is tightly controlled. You don't have to choose. Real life usually sits somewhere in between. A core group decides and directs. A wider community supplies the hands. However it was organized, the sensory experience would have been unmistakable. These were people without electric light, without machinery. Most of the work would be done in daylight, but some tasks, final rituals, transition moments, might have taken place by torchlight. Flames flickering, pillars throwing long, shifting shadows across rising rubble. As the fill climbs higher, the upper carvings on the pillars become the last things you can see. The animals near the bases disappear first under packed stone, then the mid-height hands and belts, then only faces or abstract signs still peer out above the growing surface. Someone would be there for the moment each image vanished. The last fox, the last vulture, the last human figure's hands swallowed by the rising ground. Maybe they recited old stories as they worked, lineages of those who had carved the stones, myths about the animals going back into the earth, songs that marked each layer as a chapter closed. Sound inside a half-filled enclosure would be strange, more confined. The tall pillars, once open to wind and sky, now standing in a narrowing shaft of air. Footsteps on rubble instead of bedrock. The soft hiss of poured soil, the clink of stone on stone. Voices damped and thickened as the space became more and more like a grave. Eventually the tops of the pillars reach almost to the new ground surface. A final layer of stones and earth is pulled across, and the interior circle, once a carefully bounded void, is gone. In its place, a flat or gently rounded platform. The fourth phase is levelling. Workers rake the surface, spread fine material, maybe tamp it down. If the hill is to be walked on, sat on, or built over, you want it stable. The once jagged interior becomes a continuous slope, and then perhaps marking. We don't yet have clear evidence of later monuments sitting directly on top of the earliest, fully buried enclosures, but the overall mound itself is a kind of monument, a swelling in the landscape that says, something is here, but not for you. They might have planted posts on the newly levelled surface, set up small altars, left offerings at specific spots where they knew, under metres of fill, a pillar still stood. Even without visible stone, memory can turn any patch of ground into a map. As with so much at Göbekli Tepe, we can't see the actions themselves. We see their residue, compacted layers, mixed but not random fill, pillars preserved far better than they would be if simply abandoned to the elements. From that, the step-by-step reconstruction is always a little fuzzy around the edges. Maybe the fill came in one intense campaign, maybe in pulses over the lifetimes of several generations. Maybe the work was festive, with laughter and gossip between tasks. Maybe it was solemn, with restrictions on speech and behaviour as the stones disappeared. What anchors all of these possibilities is the same quiet fact. The burial was not an accident. It was done with enough care that the enclosures were preserved, not destroyed. Enough energy that whole spaces were transformed. Enough intention that a living, open, carved interior became, in the end, a solid, silent hill. A place that used to invite you downward into its circles now pushed you gently away, up and over its rounded back. Whatever they believed about the stones, their powers, their stories, the act of burial turned a site of gathering into a site of memory. And under your feet, the pillars waited, unseen, for someone else, in another age, to dig them out again. For now, most of those pillars are still waiting. Only a fraction of Göbekli Tepe is actually excavated. Different estimates put it at around 10%. Maybe a little more depending on how you define the boundaries of the site. What we walk through today, the famous big enclosures with their towering T-pillars, is just a window cut into a much larger buried landscape. Geophysical surveys, things like ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry, show circular and rectangular anomalies beneath the surface. More enclosures, more architecture, maybe more phases of use and burial. But they're lines on a screen, not yet stones in the daylight. That partial view shapes everything. When we say this is the earliest or this marks the end, we're saying it based on the small portion that's been cleaned, mapped and described so far. A single new enclosure, slightly older or slightly later, could shuffle the whole sequence. A new kind of carving in an unexcavated area could change how we read the animals, the humans, the symbols. The hill is still editing the story by staying closed. Archaeologists are not leaving it buried because they're uninterested. They're leaving it because excavation is by nature destructive. The moment a pillar meets air and light again, the clock starts ticking. Stone that sat comfortably for 10,000 years in cool, buffered sediment suddenly has to cope with temperature swings, rain, wind, salts migrating to the surface. Microcracks widen, surfaces powder, carvings blur. If you dig too fast, you create more archaeology than you can care for, more pillars to consolidate, more walls to stabilize, more surfaces to shelter. In a very real sense, you can excavate a site to death. So, for Göbekli Tepe, there is a kind of truce with time. Open a bit, document it carefully, protect what you've exposed, then pause. Let future teams, with better methods and better conservation tools, tackle the rest. In the meantime, a lot of the work happens in ways that don't involve big open trenches. Geophysics lets researchers see shapes under the soil without touching them. Magnetometry picks up changes in the magnetic signature of buried stone and fill. Ground-penetrating radar sends signals down and listens for reflections from walls, pits, and floors. Together, these techniques sketch an underground map, where the enclosures cluster, how deep they are, how they relate to each other. On the microscopic end of the scale, there's micromorphology. That's the study of sediments as if they were thin-section rock samples. Tiny slices of fill, resin set and examined under powerful microscopes, can reveal trampling surfaces, ash lenses from fires, dung traces from animals that might have been kept nearby, the difference between wind-blown dust and material poured in by hand. Layers that look like just dirt to the naked eye can resolve into stories of repeated use, cleaning, burning, burying. Residue analysis adds another layer. Scrapings from stone tools, grinding slabs or floor surfaces can hold faint chemical ghosts, blood proteins, plant starches, fat residues. Under the right conditions, you might pick up whether a particular area was used more for plant processing or meat butchery. Whether certain vessels held rendered fat or pigments or something like fermented drink. None of this will resurrect a full menu of a feast. But it can lean the balance toward one picture or another, a place of occasional spectacular ceremonies, or somewhere woven into seasonal subsistence. Then there's time itself, measured more precisely. Radiocarbon dating has tightened over the decades, with better calibration curves and more careful sampling strategies. Newer techniques can focus on smaller samples, target short-lived materials like seeds or specific bone chunks, and tie particular events, like a floor resurfacing or a final fill episode, to a more precise window in calendar years. Optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL, can date when sediment grains last saw sunlight. That's especially useful in a site built and then buried in stages. It could help bracket exactly when an enclosure was sealed or when a slope was reshaped. All of that data feeds into digital reconstructions. 3D modelling lets archaeologists record the position of every stone, every pillar, every cut in 3 dimensions. You can then unfill an enclosure virtually, roll back the layers, test how light would have fallen at different times of day or year, explore how sound might have bounced between pillars. You can also simulate different sequences. What if the northern enclosure was built after the southern one? What if this wall was already half buried when that pillar was carved? You're still guessing, but the guesses become constrained by physics and geometry instead of living only in imagination. Even with all these tools, there's a deliberate slowness. Preservation versus excavation isn't just a scientific question, it's an ethical one. How much of a finite, fragile site do you open now for current research questions, current funding cycles, current fashions in theory? How much do you leave as a sealed archive for people 50 or 100 years from now, who might have methods we can't currently imagine? Laser-fine material analysis that needs no samples taken. Climate-controlled site coverings shaped by computer models. Non-invasive ways of reading pigments that have long faded from human sight. Every trench dug today takes something away from those futures. There are also questions about ownership and meaning. Göbekli Tepe sits in a specific modern landscape, within a modern country, near modern communities, for whom it can be a source of pride, revenue, identity, but also disruption, restriction or erasure of their own more recent histories on that land. How much of the hill is open to tourism? How much is kept off limits for protection? Whose stories are told on the signs, in the visitor centres, in the documentaries? Who gets to decide what counts as responsible research? These are not problems that residue analysis can solve, so the work moves forward carefully and the unanswered questions pile up. We still don't fully know whether Göbekli Tepe was the centre of a wide ritual network, or just one important node among peers. Whether different enclosures were used by different groups, clans, language communities, seasonal visitors, or whether everyone shared the same spaces at different times. Whether the hill's final burial came as part of a wider regional shift, mirrored exactly at other sites, or whether each community made its own decision, at its own pace. We don't yet know if the carvings encode a specific myth cycle, a star lore, a calendar, or a more flexible symbolic vocabulary whose meanings flowed and changed generation by generation. We don't yet know how the people who closed the hill thought about those who had first raised the pillars. Were they looking back with fidelity, trying to hold on to an old way as long as possible? Or were they already part of a new world, respectfully putting an older one to rest? Future excavations could catch a more detailed rhythm of time, more building phases, more small fires, more repairs that would refine the story of how long the site was truly active. New technologies might clarify what was eaten, what was brewed, what was painted, what was sung about in that place. They might sharpen the outlines of the surrounding settlements, the fields, the paths people walked to get there. But even in the best case, some things will remain out of reach. No device will conjure the exact words spoken under those pillars. No scan will replay the precise emotions felt when the last carving disappeared under rising fill. As we move toward the end of the story, that's where Göbekli Tepe sits, balanced between what the stones, the sediments, and the bones can still whisper to us and what will always stay quiet. Enough evidence for strong, grounded explanations. Enough gaps for mystery to persist. In the final part, we'll gather those threads together, what seems most likely about why the hill was raised and why it was buried, and then let the unanswered questions do what they've always done best. Keep the past just strange enough that our minds don't quite settle, even as our bodies drift toward sleep. So where does all of this leave us when we come back to that central puzzle? They built Göbekli Tepe. Then they buried it. On the firmest ground, archaeologists see a pattern of intentional closure. Enclosures used, refurbished, recarved, and then deliberately filled. Pillars carefully entombed rather than knocked down. Layers of sediment that look poured, tipped, carried, not simply the slow work of wind and time. That fits a ritual logic we see in many cultures. When a sacred place has done its work, you don't just abandon it. You close it, you make its ending part of its meaning. Layered onto that are transitions. The world around Göbekli Tepe was changing. Wild herds thinning and moving. People experimenting with tending plants, penning animals, settling closer to fields and water sources. The hill may have belonged to an older way of gathering, feasting and negotiating. Burying it could have been a way of saying, that chapter is over, and another has begun. Then there are the practical threads. A massive stone complex on a windy ridge is hard to maintain. Walls slump, surfaces crack, pillars lean. At some point the cost of repair outweighs the benefit of keeping it open. Filling the enclosures stabilizes them, smooths the hill, makes the place safer and more usable for whatever comes next. Fields, paths, low walls, new shrines. Social change weaves through all of this. Different groups rising and fading. Alliances shifting. New identities forming around villages and harvests instead of distant feasting hills. The decision to cover Göbekli Tepe may have been as much about people as about stones, a community choosing what to remember, what to transform, and what to gently remove from everyday sight. Beyond those broad strokes, we move into softer light. Ideas about hiding a dangerous knowledge or sealing away a cosmic secret are possible, but they're not required by the evidence. The fill doesn't scream emergency. it reads more like long, organised work than like frantic burial. If there was hiding here, it may have been of a quieter kind, hiding not from some monster in the sky, but from the slow erosion of meaning. You take a place that once gathered thousands. You decide it should no longer anchor your calendar, your stories, your trade. So you turn it into memory. You draw a boundary between then and now. Filling the enclosures is how you fix that decision into the ground. Under the soil, the pillars stay in their positions, still facing each other, still carrying the animals and symbols that mattered. Above the soil, a simple hill, a place you can walk over, point to, tell children, under there is where our ancestors did things a different way. In that sense, the burial is both an ending and a kind of archive. A way of ending an era without erasing it. That double quality is part of why Göbekli Tepe's mystery endures. We have enough data to sketch a plausible story, intentional closure, guided by ritual ideas, happening in a time of environmental and social change, carried out in ways that are practical as well as symbolic. But not enough to lock it down into a single sentence. Not enough to say with absolute confidence, this is what they believed, this is what they feared, this is what they hoped for when the last basket of fill was tipped in. The gap between those two levels, the solid scaffolding and the missing interior, leaves room for your mind to move, to drift between images of torches and night skies, of animal herds and first fields, of hands pressing down the final layer of stone and earth. As you lie there, maybe half asleep, you're doing something very old, taking limited evidence and spinning it into a story that helps the world feel just a little more connected. If you'd like more journeys like this, slow walks through deep time that don't demand an answer right away, you can support this channel by tapping like, subscribing, and letting the algorithm know you want more history as a background to rest. When you're awake enough, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. A city name, a country, 2 a.m. on the night shift, just after sunset in my bedroom. Those small coordinates turn this from a monologue into a quiet map of scattered listeners, all tuned to the same ancient hill. And if you want to go further, there's a book I've put together about 12 prehistoric secrets. Göbekli Tepe is one of them, but it sits alongside other forgotten bottlenecks, vanished coasts and buried rituals. You can read more and find out how to get a copy at the link in the description. For now, Göbekli Tepe can rest where its builders left it, mostly buried, partly revealed, held between what we can know and what we can only imagine. A hill that was never just a hill. A question we're not quite supposed to finish answering, even as we close our eyes and let the past fade back into the dark.